more of what I've been doing is kind of overview stuff. And I just want to get everybody to know these things are out there and just kind of a general gist and be, wait, somebody said something about that. And so you just have that initial spark to know to run to look for something of that nature. So we're going to talk about common design patterns. And these are just things you'll see over and over and over as you build more and more software. Now, to start, there's the framework patterns. Most everybody's heard of MVC, Model View Controller. And now we've started to see some MVCS. And I'll give a little bit of a description of what's going on with that as well. So you have the model and the view and the controller, and each have kind of a distinct sort of thing that they do. The part of MVC that has shifted people to kind of a different view of things is that everybody has their own sort of idea of what MVC actually means. Sometimes the model is the heavy part. Sometimes the controller is the heavy part. It really kind of depends on where you want to put that logic. The model, typically, especially with web applications, is where your data is stored. Like your user object or your page object, that sort of stuff. That will have all of that data. And then your controller is what takes that data and does whatever it needs to do to it to get it ready to go into the view. The view is generally always light. It's using either PHP or there's lots of template languages, probably the most popular of which being Smarty or Twig. People have different views on how much logic should be in the view itself. I try and just keep it minimal just to make it as simple and straightforward as possible. Now when you go over and you start to look, because people do have this debate of where that set of logic should be, because you have your business rules. And some people put them in the model and some people put them in the controller, and so that has kind of spawned MVCS, which has model, view, controller, and a service layer that all of your business logic then goes into. So now you have your model that's always light, and your view that's always light, and your controller that's always light. And you have your service, which is always heavy-ish. Because the push to the service level does things like the dependency container and dependency injection that I've been talking about. And so while your services are heavy, they're made up of lots of very small things that do very simple things that together do very complex, that are capable of doing things that are very complex. Now there's all sorts of other patterns aside from the basic framework stuff that you'll see. The composite pattern is interesting because it lets you take a couple of different things that don't really relate, but that you need to build a single thing. The best example is the document object model in the browser. Is you have multiple tiers of nodes, and some of them are leaves and some of them are branches. But we give them all the same interface so that you always know how to interact with it, even if it doesn't need that part of the code. Now you have the decorator pattern. The decorator pattern is interesting when you need to add an extended set of functionality. Like the example I thought of was if you have an API that you can query to return the bank accounts that you have. You might use the decorator pattern over that API so that you can say, I want the checking accounts, or I want the savings accounts, so that you can just do more abstract things without having to modify the original source of the file, or the original source of the API. Now there's the proxy pattern, which is interesting because it lets you do things without telling anybody. If you take that same API example, say maybe you have a lot of hits going to that API for the same question. And so you can use the proxy pattern and you take the exact same interface that you're building to and nothing else looks different from the outside, but you actually stick a cache in the middle of it. And so while nobody else sees anything, nobody else knows anything else is going on, you're caching that stuff and you don't have to do any extra work. The iterator pattern, everybody's already seen. If you've ever done a for each, you've used an iterator. It's basically just trying to make something transversable and just an easy way to go through a collection of items. The observer pattern you've definitely seen if you've done some JavaScript stuff. And more than likely you've probably seen it elsewhere in PHP, depending on how much you've done. It lets you subscribe something to another object. It uses a couple different terminologies, but it's the same pattern. If you see something that says subscribe or observe or notify, that's all going to be the observer pattern. It's going to be something that you notify when something else changes. There's a strategy pattern, which is really ending up getting used a lot in stuff I've been doing recently. You have multiple possible implementations of something that all conform to the same interface. One example would be maybe multiple methods to encrypt a set of data, depending on, and you'd pick a different one depending on attributes of that data. So maybe some are really memory intensive when the data is large, and some are faster. And just depending on the size of data that you're encrypting, you'll want to pick a different strategy. But you have all these things that use the same set of agreed commands, so that you can use them interchangeably down the line. The last one you'll see probably a lot is the singleton pattern. It has the benefit of allowing you to easily access the class from basically anywhere in your code, which is helpful when you don't have already a dependency injection sort of system in place. I actually used the singleton pattern to put dependency containers in software that wasn't built for them, which is very helpful, especially when you're used to dealing with them, as I've kind of grown accustomed to. The other advantage of it is it lets you make sure that you only have one instance of that item. You're not necessarily bound using the singleton pattern to using a static that you always pull in from everywhere, but it's helpful when you need to make sure you don't have more than one instance, like if you're keeping track of some sort of stateful information. It lets you keep track of that very simply.